going to present what I think is a very cool, fun paper by Tong Liu over there and his co-authors Hankins and Saussure. The paper is called Driving a Bargain. So it's easy to remember. Hopefully you remember the paper. Driving a Bargain, Negotiation Skill and Price Dispersion. So this paper is about how hospital outpatient prices are determined in negotiations between hospitals and insurers. There's a kind of workhorse model, the Nash-Nash bargaining model, that's kind of taken off in empirical industrial organization. Ho and Lee won the Frisch Medal for using it to look at the effects of insurer competition on premiums and reimbursements. It's a model of multilateral contracting that determines contracting terms between downstream and upstream firms. And in this case, that will be hospitals that provide services and insurers. The insurers and the hospitals are going to negotiate over what an insurer has to pay a hospital when one of their enrollees turns up for care. And, you know, basically what this model looks like is we have a bunch of pairwise Nash bargains. As you might have seen Nash bargaining in grad school. Maybe now you've seen Nash in Nash bargaining. Hospital H is in the network for insurer I. The reimbursements are chosen to maximize this Nash product, which is the product of their gains from trade, from being a network, raised to bargaining powers. And this has been a remarkably successful and influential model in Health I/O for thinking about how these reimbursements are determined. Partly the reason is if you just took a Nash-Bertrand model and tried to set hospital prices off it, because patients are often very unresponsive to cost sharing since, you know, they're insured a lot, you would often find that the reimbursements don't kind of line up with what you'd think they would, and this helps you kind of get around that. Another thing is that, you know, in I/O, maybe I should expound on this more, but often what we do is we use the first order conditions from firm pricing and data on prices and estimates of demand to back up marginal costs. And this literature kind of is use data, if it can get it, data on reimbursements and data on marginal costs, along with this model of how negotiations happen to back out these bargain weights, these betas, the exponents in this Nash product. And that brings us to the question in this very cool paper, because really there's not been that much work done exploring where these bargain weights come from and what are they. Some people would think of them as a residual that rationalizes how surplus is split up between hospitals and insurers when they negotiate, so that our model reconciles with the data, but that's not particularly satisfying. The key idea of this paper is, what if it's the case that hospital executives who are better at negotiating in their personal lives manage to negotiate better reimbursements for the hospitals, and that's why the bargain weight's larger, right? So maybe when, you know, hospital H, I'm an exec at hospital H, and I'm not very good at negotiating, and I get a crummy deal when I buy a car, then when I negotiate prices, my beta H for my hospital system is pretty low, and we get a bad deal. But Tong's actually a really good negotiator. When he goes and buys his car, he gets them way down under MSRP, and so his beta is a lot bigger, right? Is that part of what's going on? And, you know, how might we know? And what might we make of that? How much might kind of individual differences in negotiating ability explain the dispersion and the reimbursements that different hospitals get for the exact same product, which we know from the literature, like Zach Cooper's paper, can be vast, right? The kind of P10 to P90 ratio for the exact same service, hospitals often have like a threefold difference in reimbursements, right? And how much of that is due to idiosyncrasies in the negotiating abilities of the bargaining team? Given how much money's at stake, it's kind of interesting. So I think this is an incredibly well-motivated paper.
I
I italicized, super cool idea, okay? So these authors are gonna match data on what hospital executives pay for their personal automobiles and look at whether or not that predicts what they get as reimbursements for the hospital, okay? Now, we're gonna, I'll say, quibble with, some of the ways this exactly plays out on the data. They don't have maybe necessarily the exact perfect data that we'd love, but this is just like so cool in any case, right? So let's see what they have. So this will be the structure of the talk. I'll talk about the data, and it's incredible data. Then I'll talk about how they measure negotiation skills. Oops, what? Is it a touch screen? What did I do? This is a touch screen. Weird. It'll work, it's just smaller. I'll talk to you about how they measure negotiation skills. Okay, I should have just touched it again apparently, but maybe not twice. Okay, thank you so much. Then I'll look at the descriptive evidence that suggests that the negotiation skills of hospital executives matters in terms of predicting hospital reimbursements. Talk about a little bit about the Nash bargaining model that they estimate, and then look at the counterfactual that they do, which kind of asks how much price dispersion would be reduced if there weren't these idiosyncrasies in bargaining skills or negotiation skills across hospital execs. Okay. So the first data set is a cool data set, but it's kind of more typical to what we might have seen in health econometrics before. It's a large data set on utilization and reimbursements, okay? So it's called Clarivate Real World Data. They're going to use data in Texas from 2013 to 2021. Okay, COVID's in there. I'm not exactly sure, but I followed how they're dealing with that, and I don't think it's the really important thing. But they have data on 20 million outpatient hospital visits in Texas over this time period, and for 35% of those, they see data on the allowed amount, which is what's actually reimbursed by the insurer to the hospital system, so we know the actual payment, not just the charge. But that's kind of data that we might have seen before. Another data set that we might have seen before, they have data. They use the American Hospital Association's annual surveys to identify hospital executives in each hospital system. So the data actually has the name and the title of some of the management, and they're looking for the hospital system's highest manager, so president or CEO of the hospital. And that gives them data on just under 2,000 hospital managers at 700 facilities for just under 100 systems. And then they go and get data on new and used vehicle transactions from the Texas DMV, with data on 50 million sales of cars, with information on the buyer and the seller names, the dealer licenses, the vehicle characteristics, including model, make, trim, manufacturing year, and even the VIN of the vehicle, so you can find out all sorts. You put this into a VIN lookup and learn all sorts about the vehicle. And they restrict to dealers who sell to retail customers, and some other restrictions may end up with 9 million sales. If this wasn't, enough data, they go and grab data from Nexus Public Records to try and get demographic information about the managers. And then they also get hospital costs from HCRIS. This is kind of important because when we use Nash bargaining to estimate the bargaining weights, we kind of need data on both the prices and the costs, because there's not enough equations to recover both the bargaining weights and the costs at the same time. And so you need to have some information on the costs. This is, in their data, but this is a fact that we kind of knew. These box and whisker plots showing you the dispersion for different procedures in their data, so X-ray exams on the shoulders, hands, knees, ankles, and feet. The dispersion across hospitals and the allowed amounts. But we knew already from Zach Cooper's paper that you could, zoom really, you can look for the most homogeneous services in hospitals that you'd think, it's the exact same thing. Everybody should probably pay the same. And the 10 to 90th percentile ratio of reimbursements is a factor of 3 often. Okay, so there's also a big dispersion in this data. And part of the question is this because of idiosyncrasies in the bargaining process? That would be interesting to know, I think. Here's data on the hospital manager vehicle purchases and compared to the general public, because they have 9 million purchases of retail cars at dealers, and they know which ones were bought by hospital execs and which ones were bought by other people. So, this is the reason this is why I wanted to stand by the computer. So, hospital managers tend to buy cars that are more expensive, $57,000 for a car instead of $37,000 for the rest of the population. Maybe not too surprising. They buy more cars over the data sample, 4 versus 2. Cars that are more likely to be new, have a lower odometer reading, more likely to be farm branded. So, for example, they're much more likely to buy BMWs. Okay, so, what's going to be a really key variable here, though, is we're going to know what I guess it's on the title. I've only bought a car once. I'm not exactly sure, but they know what the manager paid for the car. And from the VIN, and they know the make, model, and year, and the trim, they can get a sense of the MSRP, or the list price. And so they know, who's going in and paying the full list, or who's getting a good deal, right? And does that matter? So let me talk about how they measure negotiation skill. So what they're going to do here is they're going to run an OLS of sales price, well, it's the log of the vehicle sales price, for customer I buying vehicle J from dealer D at time T. White customer in bold. So this is both estimated on the sample of people who are hospital execs and not. That's going to give us much more information about what other people pay for the same car, not just other hospital execs, and you'll see it all come back again later. So what's going to be on the left-hand side is the log vehicle sales price. On the right-hand side is going to be car characteristics. They know a lot about the cars. Demographic characteristics of the buyers. Information on the number of competitors of the dealer, the distance between the dealer and the purchaser, fixed effects, and an error term. And the fixed effects that they're going to use are vehicle, make, model, trim, by model year fixed effects. So we're going to be looking at people who buy a Toyota Camry. I'm not even totally sure I know what trim means, but with a certain amount of trim that was manufactured in 2018, we're going to be looking at all people who buy that same type of vehicle. They're going to have dealer fixed effects, year-month fixed effects, and county fixed effects. And they're going to define negotiation skill for each manager as the first negative residual from this regression. Okay? So it's the minimum over T of the residual, so the first residual for a manager, then take the negative sign of that. That's going to be their measure of negotiation skill. And what this means is that if we see a manager who has a negotiation skill of 0.1, they paid, because it's a log on the left-hand side, they paid 10% lower for their vehicle than we would have predicted based off the vehicle make, model, trim, year, the dealer, and everything else. Okay, so they got 0.1 means they got a better deal than a typical person buying the same kind of vehicle. So this is where I have a question. I think what they're doing is reasonable, but I think, there is a challenge here, which is, so by defining the negotiation skill as these residuals, the residuals are going to be orthogonal to all of these characteristics inherited by the OLS normal equations. And that's kind of how we estimate OLS. And so it really becomes super critical what you put on the right-hand side here. right? So yes, we definitely want, say, make, model, trim, year, fixed effects. Then we're looking at, if you had a more negative residual, you got a lower price than other people buying with, say, make, model, year, trim than you. Maybe you're a better negotiator, right? But here it becomes a little maybe more difficult because you could imagine you could put things on the right-hand side that might actually pick up the negotiation skill that you're looking for, right? So for example, these demographic characteristics include, include marital status, right? So I was telling Tom, suppose that people who are married are good negotiators. Maybe that's partly how they get married and stay married, right? And so maybe negotiation skill is kind of very correlated with marital status. Are you married? And, negotiation skill reduces the price you pay, right? Then when we put marriage in here, we might be reducing our measure of negotiation skill by taking some of it out of this residual and putting it onto the right-hand side here, right? In some sense, the challenge here is that the goal should be to control for determinants of price that are uncorrelated with true negotiation skill, but not control for determinants of price that are correlated with true negotiation skill. And that becomes a little bit of a kind of a balancing act. So the paper's doing work on such a cool idea that, I think I would say everything I'm saying is a quibble. I think that what's on the right-hand side is reasonable here, but you could definitely see why people might ask them, can you try this on the right-hand side? Can you try that on the right? Can you take these out? I'm worried that they're going to soak up what's actually negotiation skill. Okay. This is the distribution of negotiation skills. So my understanding is this is the distribution for managers, because it doesn't quite look centered to me. And as long as there's a constant on that right-hand side, residuals will be mean zero, so it should be centered. So then I guess what means is the non-managers actually have better negotiation skills from hospital execs. I think that's something that could be checked. It's interesting. The authors have done such a data lift. This is crazy. I didn't even mention this is there's another data set here. I mean, there's more than another data set. There are many more data sets. But here's one more data set that the authors have used to try and get us to believe that they're measuring negotiation skill. So they've gone and found, I don't even know if I put the data set that they got this from on the data slide. I don't think I did. But they've tried to find, for these hospital execs, houses that they've purchased and sold, and see how much their houses appreciated in value over, say, the time that they owned them. And looked at whether or not the hospital execs that happen to buy houses that appreciate more in value are the same execs who happen to buy cars below MSRP. I guess the idea is, if I'm good at negotiating on my car and get a big reduction under MSRP, perhaps I'm also good at negotiating when I buy a house and get a reduction on my house price, which means that when I get to sell it, it appreciates more in value and I make a higher return, right? There's some idea that there's some stability in this negotiation skill across domains, right? And that's what they find, that here we've got a bin scatter plot. On the x-axis is the negotiation skill of the hospital managers that they have. On the y-axis is the annualized net capital gains of the houses that the manager sold, and managers that get reductions of more from MSRP when they buy cars get more gains on their housing returns. Okay? This is off a little bit of a small sample, but it's cool. And the authors have just done so much work here. Okay. Now, this isn't a criticism of Tong's paper per se, and this is a little bit orthogonal to anything, what I'm about to say next. But this is a bin scatter plot. There's no R squared on this bin scatter plot. It's a pet peeve of mine, okay? I think all bin scatter plots should have R squareds, and researchers should know this. And if you're teaching econometrics, you should teach your students this, because bin scatter plots are becoming prolific. And so I just made and stated this morning. Okay, here are two data sets, and these are their bin scatter plots. And the R squared of this is almost 1, and the R squared of this is much, much smaller. But when you do the bin scatter plot, you can't tell the difference, okay? So when you do a bin scatter plot, you need to put the R squared on it, because otherwise I have no idea if the data underlying is that or that. okay? I don't know if everybody already knows this or not, but everybody needs to know this. And if you're teaching econometrics, your students deserve to know this, okay? Because bin scatter plots have become prolific. So that's kind of just a tangent. This isn't like about Tong's paper per se. Okay. Does this negotiation skill that they've measured based off the MSRP reductions matter for hospital reimbursements? So they do a lot in basic of reduced form work to show that it looks like if your hospital system has a president or CEO who gets a bigger reduction on their car purchase, then they also get higher reimbursements for the hospital system. That's what this bin scatter plot shows, this positive correlation. So on the right, we have the people who paid less for their cars. And as we move up, we have hospital systems where they get reimbursed more for the exact same service. And you see that they're positively correlated. So when the CEO gets a bigger reduction of MSRP for their cars, the system seems to get higher reimbursements. I think that's very cool. Then we're going to turn that into a regression model. We're going to go OLS of the price index that manager I gets for hospital H with insurer K and yet T. The key right-hand side variable is this negotiation skill measure, plus a bunch of fixed effects. There are hospital fixed effects in hospital executive negotiation skills. So if each hospital only had a single negotiator for all of the data, we wouldn't be able to estimate beta, because we're just partialed out with hospital fixed effects. So this is going to rely on there being some kind of turnover of execs at hospitals. So when they do that, this is the a column here is a regression. There are 4 regressions. The left-hand side variable is a hospital price index for a hospital system with an insurer at a time period. The key right-hand side variable is the negotiation skill of the hospital exec. The coefficient of 0.56 suggests that if the negotiation skill of the exec is 10% larger, the reimbursements are 5%, 5.6% larger. So when you get 10% better deal on your car, your hospital system gets 5.6% better reimbursement on their x-rays. These use kind of an aggregated hospital system price index, but and that's why there's not that many observations. There's an observation per system, per insurer, per year. But they also have data on the exact allowed amounts at the procedure level. So this is another regression that uses encounter level data for x-rays and asks how do the allowed amounts for x-rays differ at a hospital when their CEO has a better negotiation skill. And you see that, the coefficients are about 0.6 or 0.7. For reimbursed rates for x-rays are larger at hospital systems where the CEO gets a bigger discount from MSRP for the vehicle. Now, these are all identified based off, of settings where hospitals have some turnover in the execs, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to put hospital fixed effects and the exec negotiation skill on the right-hand side of the OLS. And you might wonder, so why do the hospital execs change? And could those changes be kind of picking up other things that are going on in the hospital that are affecting its reimbursed rates? So when the authors go and manually figure out why execs have left the job for hospitals and their data, and collect data on hospitals' executive turnover that's because of deaths or retirements, at older ages. And they argue that these sources of separation are less likely to be related to other trends in the reimbursement rates of the hospital systems. And they do event study to try and figure out if on that sample of turnover, negotiation skill predicts reimbursements. And, it's not it's marginally, is it exactly significant? But maybe they can play more with the specification and show us kind of the diff and diff coefficient instead of a full event study. I think they should be applauded for doing extra work to go and have a look at this. So I'm low on time. I just want to get to the counterfactual. So the Nash bargaining model that they estimate is pretty standard. I'm doing you, the audience, a disservice if you're not familiar with Nash bargaining IO, because I've run low on time. Sorry. Okay, so in the Nash bargaining model, I already showed you this is how Nash bargaining works. When a hospital is a network for an insurer, the reimbursements are assumed to maximize this bilateral Nash product, and they do that all together, all the insurers and all the hospitals. And the gains from trade for the hospital are how much profit do we make from being on this insurer's network. And for the insurer, it would be nice to just say how much profits does the insurer make. They don't have information on premiums, so they do what other folks have done and kind of use the willingness to pay measure and assume that the insurer cares about the consumer surplus of its enrollees, less what it pays for covering this hospital network, accounting for some reallocation effect. If you take the first order condition of this Nash product after plugging in the gains from trade, you get this. It's one equation, and because we have data on allowed amounts, reimbursements, costs from HCRIS with estimated demand, it's an equation one unknown, which is just this gamma parameter, which is how much the insurer cares about consumer surplus of its enrollees. So there's one equation per bargaining rate, beta, and there's this, unfortunately, this one extra parameter here, which is this gamma, because we don't have the insurer's profits. Okay? So if we knew gamma, we'd have one equation per beta, and we would just invert to find these betas. That's kind of like how we invert to find marginal costs when we assume Nash-Bertrand competition regularly. But here, we don't need to invert to find marginal costs because we observe costs from HCRIS. So we could invert the first order conditions to back out the bargain rates. But then there's this gamma floating around. They deal with that by adding a medical loss ratio moment, which is what Kate Ho and Robin Lee did. They estimate those bargaining weights, and then they run these counterfactuals to ask what would happen to price dispersion of outpatient hospital reimbursements if the differences in management negotiation skills were eliminated, or if just the differences in bargaining weights were eliminated. Okay, so they measure price dispersion following a paper by Matt Grennan. In their data, this is the benchmark of how much price dispersion there is. I'm not exactly sure how to understand the level of this variable, but we'll be looking at percent changes. Okay, so there's this 1.13 here. Then that's just a baseline model. Then what they do is they say, what if every manager was just given the average negotiation skill? Then the dispersion will fall by 0.06 points. And they say, what if every manager was given, what if negotiations all took place with the exact same bargaining weight, so there's no difference in bargaining weights? Then the price dispersion will fall by 0.2. They take this ratio and say, they're providing evidence that suggests that this negotiation skill measure could explain, say, 28% of the price dispersion that comes from differences in bargaining weights. Okay? I think they're going to do a lot more on the counterfactuals as they push on the paper, but I think this is a really cool paper. It's a pleasure to read and to discuss. I'm out of time, right? Okay, so one last high-level question. Okay, the other thing that this paper's done a lot, but there is something that's kind of important, right? Which is, it's not clear to me which hospital employee is the right one. Like, whose negotiating skill matters? Why is it the CEO's negotiating skill? In a huge hospital system, the CEO might not even be at the table when they negotiate with an insurer, right? So I think, they've looked at hospital execs' negotiating skills. They could have looked at insurer execs' negotiating skills, right? I think they did the right thing to look at hospitals, right? Why? Insurers are really big, often, and negotiating with tons of hospitals. So they're the CEO of United. probably isn't at any of those negotiations. But you know, a regional hospital system with 3 or 4 hospitals, maybe the in any case, so
I was talking about the CEO of the hospital of
okay. Oh. So I think that, you know, there's an important question as to whose negotiation skills matter. They're not going to do that. They're going to say, we're assuming it's this top hospital system exec's negotiating skills, and we're going to run with that, and this is what you get. And I applaud them for that. And I think maybe in the future we'll look to see, you know, if we can get more data on who's in the room, who's doing the negotiating. That would be even cooler, okay? But we can't let the perfect take away from the excellent. Yeah. So.
All right, so first, thanks the organizers for including our paper in the program. And also, thank you, Alex, for carefully reading my paper and giving like very amazing comments. So I was told like on average, a paper will be read by 1.5 persons. So now, very happy now I can claim 2.5. Great. And also, Alex is also actually is my co-author. So hope you haven't been too lenient in the discussion. So first of all, I just want to quickly, like just maybe put a different way in terms of motivations. Actually, Alex provides a like amazing framework how we should understand, for example, the price dispersion in the market. So a lot of times, the literature, prior literature, try to attribute to a lot of observables, like the market powers, maybe a different type of the ownership, like for-profit hospital, non-for-profit hospitals, or like information environment. Some they have more transparency, some they do not. So a lot of times beyond these observable factors, you can think about in the model in such kind of Nash models or frameworks through the lens to understand the price dispersion. A lot of times, actually, we just attribute such kind of remaining variations we observe in the data in terms of variations to the bargaining power parameters. And most of the time, actually in the literature, people are going to interpret this as a proxy for bargaining abilities or skills. But given that, still like many people complain about that because they're residual terms. We don't know what they really a proxy for. So that's somehow like the very first step we want to understand, okay, whether they are tied to particularly the key person within organizations, whether their individual negotiation skills actually matters or rationalize such kind of bargaining power concept. So with that, actually, Alex gave, I think, an amazing summary of the paper. So regarding the comments, just very quickly response. So what controls we should include? Amazing questions. And I heard a lot of these questions. So in terms of the, in terms of the constructions, we actually intentionally include the following demographics, like the age group or the marriage status or number of kids, because we are debating actually also with internally also kind of with other researchers what kind of variables we should include, like for example like gender. So we decided to exclude gender because the prior literature shows that females typically they have lower kind of bargaining abilities or skills compared to males, or race. We also didn't include. In the end, we somehow make the compromise to intentionally include age, marriage status, number of children, because they are heavily affecting the willingness to pay for the cars. Like if you have a bigger families, definitely you are willing to pay higher prices to buy the bigger cars, or whether you're married. So to some extent, I agree with you. So we still need to debate what kind of things we should include, but we somehow make such a compromise step. And in the paper, actually, we have done like tons of the variants of the construction, but the results are almost the same. So they're robust. So the second comments you have regarding this manager versus non-managers, actually, indeed, we find actually slightly lower, but on average, in terms of the manager samples versus the general public, but not that big difference. So they're slightly kind of below. And then in terms of the being scattered R squares, well taken. Yes, we should show that. But regarding this house return, actually in the paper we put a big kind of question mark with cautions there because in the end, in Texas, unfortunately, we only collect 96 data points regarding the restate transaction because Texas does not disclose the restate deeds. So what we collect actually is for managers living in Texas, but their house purchased outside of Texas. So only 96. That's why you see a big dispersion. But like the good thing is that still like the trend is consistent. Another more convincing evidence actually in the paper we show is directly using the vehicle transactions, but just compare the listing price, the price actually the dealers they ask for versus the finalized sale price to see the gap. Actually, they are more aligned in terms of our negotiation skills measures. And lastly, great question regarding why managers matters. So we have already talked to over like a dozen of the different kind of scales of hospital CEOs, including CFOs. So consistent with your intuitions, largely for a lot of small hospitals, including small hospital systems, they do not have resources to outsource the negotiation task to the external consulting firm or third parties. So that's why the managers actually, they heavily involved in the negotiation process. So actually in the paper, we provide several case studies. It's basically based on news. All these kind of the CEOs of hospital, they're complaining like United, they're just the big players and pushing too hard. So they decline in the end in terms of their offers. But indeed, the concern is that for the much larger systems, they have resources, they hire or they outsource the process of negotiation to the third parties. So, but still, like we talk to them, they say the CEOs, they are very informed, and also the CEO's own characteristics actually are shaping the strategy of negotiation. So they are making the big decisions in terms of what kind of field we compromise, what kind of services actually we do not. So still, like that's why we think generally the CEOs, they matter in the negotiation process. Okay, I will stop here. So just to collect questions. Yeah. Thanks again. Yes.
I have two questions. One is trying to get a sense of how much the negotiation skill matters. So have you looked at if you have a CEO at the 25th percentile, the 75th percentile, or switch from one to the other, how much difference would that make in the negotiation of the prices that the hospital pays? Just some sort of set or one standard deviation. Have you looked at that?
Right, so we, not exactly the 25 percentile, 75 percentile, but we, in the paper, we look at the magnitude in terms of 1 standard deviations. For example, increase of the negotiation skills we document. This is going to translate into more than 4% increase in the price negotiation with the insurers.
And also, you look at the, if I remember correctly, the first automobile purchase, and have you looked at the others? Is there high correlation? Does it matter? The average? I mean, you're throwing away a lot of information. Why do you look at the first? And can you talk about that?
Great question. So we look at the first because, so first let me answer it in the following way. So actually they're highly persistent. We draw the time series plot almost kind of a flat line. But the reason we take the very first one, because we think that's kind of the time, because a lot of people complain, oh, once you become CEO, you become super occupied. Then the efforts, that's kind of another factors, how you're going to translate your skills into like 100% kind of potentials. So we're a little bit concerned about that. So that's why we look at basically to fully reflect their negotiation skills, we go to the time, the earliest, the very first transaction they have. Most of the time, they haven't become the CEOs.
Chris. One way for me to get a cheaper car is to be a better negotiator. Another way is for me to just put more effort in, like to look harder, to look longer. I'm not surprised that if this is how you're going to define negotiation skill, when actually like that's in the residual as well, that when you compare the hospital CEOs to everyone else, that it looks like they're worse negotiators, just the opportunity cost of their time is higher.
Great. So very quickly, so in the control, we try to control for the travel distance. This is more like a proxy for like your efforts. How far away you're willing to travel just basically to talk to the dealers. That's kind of the one, kind of like the way to elevate the concern. But I mean, I'm more with you because we cannot really tease out efforts. But if you think about it, because in the setting for vehicle transactions, you are gaining actually 100% of all the payoffs. While as a CEO, when you are like talking to this insurers, actually your compensation are not that sensitive to the revenues of the hospitals. So you may not exert 100% of the effort. So if that's the case, efforts play the role here. Actually, we are basically capturing the lower bounds of the skills, how they're going to reflect the negotiation skills, the negotiation outcomes.
Yeah, I was just thinking about an alternative measure for your bargaining. So you have the make, model, trim, right? And so and the CEO purchased a make, model, like why not compare like kind of in a matching kind of strategy with other people in the population that bought the same make, model, but because immediately you get the distance. You can obviously use characteristics and stuff, but essentially you get this person that bought a Honda Civic, whatever. Well, you have all the other people in your sample that bought the same model, blah, blah, and you can establish the distance for this and do it for each one of the CEOs.
So
Is that something?
maybe I misunderstood your question, but my understanding is that suppose we control this fixed effect, we are comparing within that model chain. So basically, we are comparing the prices within Honda CRV XL.
Right, but you see
the
the
price
distance, you see
dispersion.
the distance. You don't need to take the residual. You see exactly the distance between.
I see.
You see exactly the distance, and there's a measure of distance between what they paid with what the other paid.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Now, the other thing is just as a minor comment, suggestion is just maybe when you report those, because you generated this regressor, then you put it back into the other regressor, and just maybe just like cheap, just kind of bootstrap at the cluster level or something like that.
We did.
Okay,
You
those
know,
are both bootstrap, but they seems like it were just clustered.
Yeah, the results are pretty much the same.
Okay.
Thanks.
Ben, go first.
I was just gonna ask if counterfactuals are, it seems like the price dispersion is the outcome we've looked at so far. Then maybe we're gonna look at total spending. It seems like if we change, if we change dispersion, are we taking the high
Okay.
prices and bring them down, or taking low prices and bring them up? And how does demand change?
Yeah, so actually we don't want to remake the wheels. So we completely just follow Matt Brandon's paper, so how to measure the dispersion. I think his idea originally is trying to control the differences in terms of the costs. Because the costs, again, are going to contribute to the price dispersion you observe, or spending dispersion. So in his idea,
Total healthcare utilization, like
you in terms of, okay,
how does spending, like how does spending, because ultimately we care about price dispersion because it affects how much total healthcare.
oh, so you want to see the, basically one step further to see okay, yeah, definitely can do.
Yeah, so my comment is just, it's related, I think, to Chris's, and just, when you estimate the skill equation by OLS, the residual captures everything, not just negotiation skill. So an alternative would be to estimate it using a stochastic frontier model that has a two-sided and a one-sided error component. And then you just focus on the one-sided error component as your measure of skill.
Perfect. I'm not familiar with that, so definitely would happy to talk to you offline. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, sir.
In a similar spirit to Gabby's question, what do your numbers say about which hospitals have good negotiators?
Which hospital, sorry?
Have you looked at just like what are the characteristics of hospitals that tend to have good negotiators as CEOs? Are they for-profit, non-profit,
Yeah.
urban, rural, academic?
So actually we find a negative sorting. So it's not the most, like the largest, the kind of, the best financial conditions hospital, actually they have better negotiators. Actually it's the opposite.
What's the salary?
Good question. So we try to collect it, but it's a very small sample. But we just draw from a larger sample from the previous research. On average, the hospital managers or CEOs, the salaries is 600K.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you could use their salary as a measure.
Ideally, yes, but unfortunately, we didn't match like too much. Yeah.
Awesome.
Right, so you excluded gender here because of the difference in the
Right.
power. But when you go to the next step of estimating facts on the reinvestment rates, do you look at any gender differences?
Yeah, we observe. Among the general populations, yes, it's consistent. The females will be worse negotiators compared to male.
I know in terms of the effects on the reinvestment rates.
Just the gender, we didn't look at that.
Because of saying better accurately capturing, negotiation.
Okay.
Here, by the moment, gender
we have time for one more. So what, so I think you have two fun measures of kind of when power dynamics change, and that's, I know you control for end of month and end of year, but if you can split the sample and look at transactions near end of month and end of quarter, that's when the dynamic, or that's when the bargaining power is firmly in the buyer's side. And I think on the flip side, you can look at the HHI concentration of insurers and payers for some of these markets. And so in cases where like your blues have an 80% market share, that's a different bargaining universe. And so kind of as those estimates change, as those two different worlds change, where you have different concentrations of power, that could be a fun rock to take on.
Yeah, I love it. So definitely the first exercise we should do. So just one more word. Do I have some time? Yeah. So for the second exercise regarding the counterparty HHI, the market concentration, actually that's our second kind of like identification strategy there. Probably Alex doesn't have time to cover. So basically, we try to see the market concentrations because generally, when the insurance market become more concentrated, presumably, basically, they're going to exert negative price pressures on the hospital's prices, negotiated outcomes. We indeed find that. However, we split the sample basically for the high negotiation skills versus low negotiation skill managers. So the effect, such kind of negative effects, almost negligible among the hospitals run by the high negotiation skill managers, while like most of the negative effect we observe in the low negotiation skill managers. Yeah, so it's consistent with your assumption there. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to follow you at dinner with more questions. Thank you, everybody, for a fantastic